Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. There has been a revival of interests to explore the moon by many spacefaring countries for a variety of reasons, namely scientific, economic, and strategic. The US, China, Russia, India, Japan, and South Korea have established programs to explore the moon, and there are also a lot of interests from private space companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and iSpace. Some countries are also pursuing international collaboration with the like minded partners to enhance their understanding, capabilities, resources, and expertise to reach the moon. Further, there are also international and multilateral efforts aimed at lunar governance to ensure responsible lunar exploration. There are also countries that have released their lunar exploration approaches and strategies. Today, we are going to discuss about India's lunar strategy in the astropolitical age. Joining us today to discuss this topic is Jatan Mehta. Jatan Mehta is a globally published independent space writer and the author of Moon Monday, that is dedicated to covering lunar exploration developments from around the globe. He also writes Indian Space Progress, a monthly report contextualizing the progress of India's increasingly relevant space capabilities in the global arena. And he has also been an editorial consultant for space organizations globally. Jatan, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Tejas. Glad to be here and thank you for inviting me.
So, Jatan, my first question is, what has been the history of India's lunar exploration? When did it all start? And why is India interested to explore the moon?
Well, it certainly started with Chandrayaan 1, as we all know. But the road to get there was a long one. We had a space program starting in the late 1960s, and most of our focus back then primarily was on civilian applications of space. So we didn't really think about doing planetary exploration for a long time compared to other countries who started around in the 1960s. But there was an astrophysics group that was very active within ISRO starting in the 1980s and then 90s and so on, some of which morphed into India considering doing planetary exploration as a dedicated program eventually, and space sciences, associated space sciences, and so on. So that's broadly where Chandrayaan 1 came into the picture, and the rest is history. We know that, Chandrayaan 1 got commissioned and then we built it. We launched it in 2008. It was our first lunar orbiter, and we became one of the few countries in the world to, send a spacecraft indigenously that can orbit the moon. But not just that, it also made various scientific discoveries, because a key factor of Chandrayaan 1 was that it had many international instruments on board. Roughly half of the instruments on Chandrayaan were coming from different partner countries. So there were two of them from the US, and then there were a couple from Europe, and then the rest were from us, built in India. So it was a very international mission in that sense. And notably, what Chandrayaan 1 is most known for, which is the discovery of water ice on the moon's poles, which is what partially started this rush back to the moon, or at least it catalyzed it, certainly. So that discovery by Chandrayaan 1 came from the US instrument on board, specifically the Moon Mineralogical Mapper, M3, or M-Cube as what most people call it. So the M-Cube is what discovered water ice on the moon. And I think that's a fantastic thing, because it's an excellent example of Indo-US lunar collaboration, or rather international collaboration, doing what it's supposed to do. And it's also a good example of getting maximum scientific bang for the buck from your very first planetary mission, So yeah, that's broadly what Chandrayaan is. And I think that's a very important step we took in our, in Indian space history. And that has led now to a continuation of an expansive planetary program with Chandrayaan 2, Chandrayaan 3, Mangalyaan, soon with the Venus orbiter as well, and so on and so forth.
which I'll come, which I'll come back with my question later. But moving on to the next question, why is there a race and competition to reach the moon currently? Is it about space resources or other strategic reasons? Where do you see India in this current astropolitical race to the moon, as I would like to term? Has Chandrayaan 3 given an edge for India in this race? Or are there still more work that is needed from India?
Yeah, so there's multiple things to consider here. Firstly, while it can be termed as a race, and surely you see that, many countries are vying for the same region on the moon, which is the moon south pole, which is where we think a lot of the water ice deposits are. The maximum water ice deposits are, is what we think. Um, and there's certainly water ice, but there's a difference between water ice being present on the moon and detected from orbit, and water ice being accessible on the moon to surface missions. So that difference is not yet clear. And so, what most of the interest right now in the moon is going after these supposed large water ice deposits, but with also the uncertainty that we do not know exactly where they are in terms of local scales. We don't know how accessible they are, how easy it will be to extract it and then utilize it, and so on. So, yeah, there is a race in the sense that, people are trying to go to the same region in search of the same resources, but it's not yet at a point where there is direct competition for those resources, certainly. As much as many outlets would like to put it that way, because the truth is, simply put, we do not know. We do not know where the resources are at a local scale. So, in that sense, it's important to distinguish between the two things. But nevertheless, because we know that there's water ice somewhere, we want to find it out. And so we do have many countries trying to go there, to the moon south pole in particular, and India being one of those countries, certainly. So that's one thing. As far as, India getting an edge over others in the moon race is concerned, again, there's two ways to look at it. In some ways, we are doing very well. But if you look at the larger picture and compare it to, let's say, China's lunar program, the Chang'e program, then we are far behind, right? And in fact, even the US is far behind in terms of the actual achieved mission objectives in this decade as compared to the equivalent Chinese lunar missions. So, uh, if you look at that perspective, then we are behind. But at the same time, doing a lunar mission in itself is incredibly difficult. It's resource intensive, and nearly soft landing on the moon, as we have seen time and again recently with multiple missions, is proven to be extremely challenging. Just over the last 5 years, we have had so many moon landing failures, and even in this year, where intuitive machines and the iSpace, sorry, not the iSpace, but the JAXA Slim lander, both of these landers, while they did technically land on the moon, but they did not land in the correct orientation. And in the case of intuitive machines, it was not even a soft landing per se, it was a very rough landing. So what we are seeing very clearly that, despite the fact that the China has a remarkable lead in lunar exploration compared to any other country, however, at the same time, very few countries can even manage to soft land on the moon to begin with. So, in that sense, the fact that we have done that now with Chandrayaan 3, and we are doing, we are planning an extensive program of an increasingly complex series of Chandrayaan missions, which will build on the Chandrayaan 3 heritage. So that does give us a good solid foundation to build upon. So yeah, I would look at it that way. It's not exactly, you know, we are not doing very well, but we are not doing bad either in that context. But if you look at it in terms of indigenous capabilities, because we may not be concerned, for example, with what China is doing on the moon in every single way, because simply put, we do not have the same kind of resources, or rather, we do not invest the same kind of resources that China does for its lunar program. So, in the absence of those budgetary allocations or access to the same kinds of resources and same kinds of launch vehicle capabilities, for example, if we uh, remove them from the equation or try to normalize for that, then yes, we are doing very well because we are slowly but surely increasing what we can do on the moon. With Chandrayaan 1, we proved that we could, you know, put an orbiter in the moon. With Chandrayaan 2, we not only proved that, okay, we can not only put an orbiter around the moon, but it can do a lot of fantastic science by ourselves. And also proved some capabilities towards a lunar landing, but obviously we didn't achieve that with Chandrayaan 2. And then with Chandrayaan 3, we proved that we can not only soft land on the moon, we can do operations on the moon with the Pragyan rover, and also with the lander, we can hop on the moon, uh, relit the engines after a while of landing. And in the case of the Chandrayaan 3 propulsion module, we also proved that we can bring back something from lunar orbit to Earth orbit, which is a very small but very important capability in an eventual sample return scenario. So yeah, basically, if you look at it, we are slowly but surely, definitely, you know, finding success and making room for increasingly complex capabilities at the moment.
The progress is definitely increasing and going to be exponential. Coming back to my third question, you did emphasize that this lunar exploration is going to be challenging. And one of the important elements of this is going to be international partnership, which is seen as a crucial element for countries to pool in their resources, understanding, and expertise to reach the moon and beyond, and as well as stay in the competitive timeline to reach these places in a time bound manner. The US led Artemis program, and like you mentioned, China and Russia with their International Lunar Research Station are in the forefront of this. And if you've seen, India has decided to partner with the US and its allies. It has signed the Artemis Accords in 2023. It has participated in the Artemis Working Group and the Artemis Accords Workshop. And even at the multilateral level, if you see, India has been participating at the Working Group on Space resources at the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And it's also a signatory to the Moon Agreement when it comes to its legal, commitments. So, looking at all these things broadly, where do you see India's strategy, with regards to exploring moon? Where is its lunar strategy in this astropolitical age?
So, as you rightly pointed out, we are doing, India is part of many of these collaborative arrangements, be it direct bilateral collaboration with the US or some other countries that we have been partnering with over time, or be it part of multilateral, multi-stakeholder, programs like the Artemis Accords, for example, and so on. However, in terms of a strategy for international collaboration, it's not like we have a singular defining strategy that's leading the way. It's we are doing a little bit of everything as it makes sense to us. And but at the same time, there's certainly room for more. So, for example, we are collaborating with the US on lunar exploration, but it's not yet clear as to what form that would take, because there's a difference between, let's say, a symmetric collaboration on a moon mission, similar to how you already have ISRO and NASA collaborating on the joint NISAR Earth observation satellite, where it's a symmetric collaboration. Both the agencies are pulling in roughly the same amount of resources, bringing in the same amount of expertise, then the benefits are shared equally by both. So there's a difference between that kind of a collaboration and collaboration where you are party to a larger thing. So I'm again, not both of those things are good. I'm not saying one is much better than the other. We should do both. There's no reason to be mutually exclusive here. But there's a difference between doing that and that. The first thing and the second one. So the point is, while we signed the Lunar Artemis Accords, the US-led Artemis Accords last year, it's not yet clear as to in what form exactly are we collaborating with the US yet. There's talks for collaborating on CLIPS missions. There's talks for collaborating on the Gateway. The ISRO chief, Mr. Somnath, has also alluded to that effect. But a strategy which has been decided on and has not been made public yet. So we have to look out for that. On the other hand, we do have symmetric collaborations with Japan. We are, as you know, that there's the LUPEX rover mission wherein India will build the lunar lander, and Japan is building the lunar rover. And both the countries are contributing scientific instruments on the rover and also some on the lander as well. So that's a proper symmetric collaboration. But the situation there is that it's not being sanctioned or approved by the Union Cabinet on the Indian side yet. So we have to wait a while for that to happen. As you know, recently Chandrayaan 4 got approved, which is a sample return mission, which is fantastic. But it also means that the Lupex mission has to wait a while to for us to seek approval on from the Union Cabinet. So that's there. On the Artemis Accords side, you mentioned the working groups and the Artemis Accords workshops. So both of those mechanisms are very good. And from what I understand, so there are two different. These are two different things. From what I understand, is that so the working groups work in a very different way. There is, you have multiple countries who have signed the accords, voluntarily getting together on a shared goal. So, for example, there were certain countries who have signed the accords from Europe and the US as well. So, the US and certain countries in Europe who have signed the Artemis Accords, they have a working group wherein they're explicitly trying to figure out ways to encourage countries who do not traditionally have a space program to participate and to sign the accords and participate in the Artemis program in some way or the other. So they explicitly want countries who are not traditionally, let's say, launching satellites or doing moon missions to still be participant in the dialogue around the accords, dialogue around space resources and the advantages and challenges of that. And of course, there's another factor where the US obviously wants countries like India to be participating in the Artemis program at a greater scale, which is why we signed on to the accords as well on our side. So that's also there. So the workshop is more concerned with technological elements of the Artemis program, whereas the working groups are more concerned with goals that the countries voluntarily decide. So, for example, there could be a working group between India, Australia, and France if they decide to do so on the context of the Moon Treaty, because these three countries are signatory to the Moon Treaty, although not all of them have ratified it. But nevertheless, since there is a potential conflict between the Moon Treaty and the Artemis Accords in terms of resource extraction and who gets to get ownership over those resources, so there's certainly a plausible scenario where these three countries could get together, form an Artemis Accords working group, and try to rope others in and try to get this dialogue forward. But again, we don't have yet, as of yet, formal announcement from India on that front as to what we are going to do. So what I'm trying to say across all of these responses is that the word is not out yet, as in India still needs to figure out and still needs to make public as to what its exact approach is, and we should we should wait and watch around what happens in that. The other thing I want to touch on here is private companies, because there is certainly some interest between both the India bloc as well as the US bloc to get private companies to collaborate in lunar exploration, or not just collaborate, but also, for example, have, let's say, private does be part of the supply chain for US lunar missions somehow. And there has been certainly public intent to that effect. For example, the US-led initiative for critical and emerging technologies, which is something that the US and India collaborate on. Last year, when the joint statement came out, they said that they want to work on CLIPS missions and particularly see how Indian aerospace companies can contribute to that. So presumably it would take the form of, let's say, an Indian space company providing components to some of these US-led lunar missions or something to that effect. But based on what I know, a year on from that, nothing has come out of it. At least nothing's been made public to that effect. So again, we don't know what's happening and we don't know where it's actually going. So we should keep an eye out. And that's something that I'm actually doing on my Moon Monday newsletter, which you mentioned early on. So I'm trying to keep an eye out on these collaborations and the outcomes of them, and then track those over time.
That actually, Jatan, just focus on the privatization bit. You talked about the CLPS program and the Lunar Gateway program. I just wanted you to don the creative hat here. Where do you think are the opportunities that India can actually contribute to these missions, both India and its private sector, in terms of the CLPS program as well as in the Lunar Gateway program? Because earlier there was an opportunity for, providing airlock systems. UAE came in. So in that sense, where do you kind of see India being a part of the Gateway program in a G2G level? And even down the line, in the more B2B level, where do you see the private companies being a part of the CLPS program? Like what kind of payloads can they be part of? All assessing the current capabilities that India has.
Right. Yeah, that's something I'm very keen on myself. And the first thing is I'll just address the first thing upfront on my mind, which is about the private space company capabilities. So currently, as you know, that the Indian private space ecosystem is still maturing. We have many good companies here, but from a lunar perspective, it is still not quite there yet. We'll certainly get there with some time because it's not like the US private industry has come out of nowhere. They needed a gestation period as well, and so will we. So having said that, my takeaway for the time being for the near future is that private companies do not have a direct route to collaborate on or contribute to US led missions other than maybe supplying some components, but which again, given the clips example that I just cited in our last response, it's not looking very positive just yet. But so basically, we just need to give some time for that to happen. So that's one part. But uh, what private companies and traditional contractors and vendors can certainly do is be part of these collaborations via ISRO, where there's so much room and we can do so much there. And what are the things we can do? For example, well, um, the ISRO chief, Mr. Somnath, has already said on multiple occasions, including at the Indian Planetary Science Conference last year in Ahmedabad at PRL, that NASA has shown interest in flying ISRO scientific instruments in particular, on US missions. So that could take the form of NASA CLIPS missions, or it could take the form of Artemis surface crewed missions, or the Artemis Gateway orbital habitat. So now that depends on what NASA is interested in. But what they have basically done is being given an overview of what instruments India built for the Chandrayaan program, namely the Chandrayaan 1 orbiter, the 2 orbiter, and the Chandrayaan 3 lander and rover. So they are, quite happy about our capabilities, and they want to fly those instruments, at least in terms of their high level intent on some of these missions that they have. So it would be interesting to look out if this path is something that ISRO pursues, and how if we actually manage to get an instrument on board one of these US led missions. So that's one. The other thing we can do potentially in the future, and which Mr. Somnath has definitely said with a keen interest, is that we could potentially do cargo supply for the gateway. You mentioned the example of the airlock, which now UAE is providing. So there's no room for that. And it's not like we have that capability right now anyway. But the cargo supply is something that we are actively building with Gaganyaan. So there's a cargo supply mission. There are two cargo supply missions that are already planned and made public within the Gaganyaan program. The first is the cargo supply mission to our own first module of the eventual Indian space station. And the second is a cargo supply mission to the International Space Station later this decade. So those are things that the intents of which have been already announced. So once that capability is something that we demonstrate, after that we can start seriously looking at doing cargo supplies on the moon as well, wherein we would be combining our capability to do cargo supply to the ISS with the capability to put something in lunar orbit and bring it back, which is again something which we have already demonstrated the latter part. So I see this as an excellent fit, and I hope that works out. So that's one thing. The other thing is we could do a lot of academic and scientific collaboration. For example, we are, with the recently approved Chandrayaan 4 mission, we aim to bring 2 to 5 kilograms of lunar samples from somewhere on the moon. And from wherever it comes, it's fantastic because the sample return is insanely valuable in terms of its value compared to a surface only mission, because now you have the samples brought to Earth in your laboratory and you can study them with all the exquisite instruments you want, which you can't otherwise send on mass constrained flight hardware. Um, but more importantly, it also enables you to, you know, um, elevate India's stance in the scientific community, by offering the Chandrayaan 4 samples, let's say, to be studied by other countries, because this is something other countries do all the time. For example, the Japanese Space Agency JAXA and NASA have so. For example, the Japanese Space Agency JAXA and NASA have a tie-up wherein they have exchanged samples from their respective asteroid sample return missions, and that's a fantastic opportunity for both of those academic institutions to to have more scientific bang for the buck than what just they themselves invested in. So India can do something similar with the Chandrayaan 4 sample return mission, where we could say to NASA, hey, we will provide you our samples for studies. And in return, it would be great if you could provide us not just the Apollo samples, but which we already study anyway, but also some of these Artemis samples, which would be immensely valuable as well. So that there's a very, very good opportunity there. That's one. But there's also the other thing is that we have leverage there because, if you look at the situation with the Chang'e 5 sample returns, China bought samples from the moon already in 2020, and then again in, earlier this year from the Chang'e 6 sample return mission. And both of these samples are very interesting and very valuable. Specifically with Chang'e 5, what we have seen is, that the US has the US scientific community has shown such an interest in those samples that they have convinced NASA to get an exception from the US Congress, an exception from the Wolf Amendment, that is, to be able to apply for studying those samples, which would otherwise not have been possible because of the blockage imposed by the Wolf Amendment. So what you're seeing is that even the lunar samples are so valuable that the US is willing to, remove their own suspension of collaboration with the Chinese, however temporarily or however with a specific mechanism, but nevertheless, they're willing to do that. So in our case, there's no such blockage. If anything, India and US are on a very collaborative high right now, which means that if China is able to leverage that kind of a scientific value out of their samples that they bought from the moon, imagine the opportunities we have on tap with Chandrayaan 4.
So this just brought me back to the point that I wanted to ask you. Is the time ripe for India to kind of formally establish a space resource institute like what other countries are doing? Or has India already established a space resource institute? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question and not something anyone has ever asked or I've thought about. But my first thoughts are that, well, before we establish a Space Resource Institute, which would be wonderful, I'm sure, because there are equivalents existing in the US and Europe, as you know, and specifically in Luxembourg with the European Space, I forget the full name, but there's a ESA Institute, ISRIC, yeah. I forget its full name, but anyway, it's dedicated to space resources, and that would be fantastic to have. But there is a precursor to it which we don't have yet fully, and which we should build first, and which I'm certain that we will, or at least hopeful that we'll build with Chandrayaan 4, which is to even have the ability to store samples in an appropriate manner for longevity, and study them at scale. So right now, the sample studies that we do of planetary samples, that is, are mostly constrained to PRL in Ahmedabad. And they do study the samples from the Apollo missions, from the former Soviet Lunar missions, from the JAXA asteroid sample return mission, Hayabusa, and so on. They do study those, but those are at a relatively smaller scale right now. and we don't yet have initial sample storage and processing facilities where we do broad characterization of samples, and then it's disseminated out to, for these finer sample return studies across organizations. So first we need to build that. And obviously with Chandrayaan 4, we will have to build that. So that will come along. But we just don't need to build it. We also need to have an expansive set of, institutions and universities doing sample studies. It can't be that, it's only ISRO that does it. It has to be other people in the broader academic community, both within India and abroad, that does this, right? And then on that foundation, you build a Space Resources Institute. And certainly it can, leverage and feed back into that. But yeah, we first need to take a more fundamental step before doing this.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Jatin. So moving on to my next question, you mentioned about the CLPS program that NASA is running, and we also recently saw CLPS missions like Viper being cancelled due to cost overruns and delays. So, are there some lessons that the Indian private sector and even India for a space program that can be drawn from what happened to Viper?
Yes. So, okay, one thing is that, well, in if you look at it in a programmatic way, we don't really have much to learn from Viper in the sense that Viper is part of a very complicated and of a very complex, much more ambitious, broader lunar program from the US side, which has multiple high-level elements vis-a-vis Artemis, CLIPS, and so on, and gateway and associated elements and so on. So in that sense, well, ISRO's lunar program is very linear. We do one mission at a time. We did Chandrayaan 1, 2, 3 in succession, and that too with multiple year gaps in between, and so on. We have a much tighter budget compared to NASA or even the Chinese National Space Agency. So in that sense, we do a very linear series of missions. So we have to really focus on what we will do next, and that's what ISRO has now decided, that Chandrayaan 4 will be that point of focus going ahead. So in that sense, we don't really have much to learn from Viper's cancellation directly. But what we do have is an opportunity that I think we have somewhat lost in the short term. With Viper's cancellation, what has happened is, or at least a potential cancellation anyway, because they are still trying to scramble their way out to see if Viper can be revived in some form or the other. But well, we'll just talk about the situation as it is now. And in the event of a Viper cancellation or a massive launch delay, anyway, what it deprives the US and its partners, including India, from is that we will be that much farther away from knowing the ground truth of lunar resources on the moon's south pole. Because if Viper doesn't go and scout the moon's south pole terrain, go inside permanently shadowed regions, drill there, use its instruments to sense the presence of water underground as well as on the surface, then we simply do not know the ground truth of water ice. And if we do not know the ground truth of water ice, we do not know how much of it is accessible, if it's even as large as we think it is from orbital data. And then all of this hoopla about, a potential moon race and whatnot will just disappear, right? But if we don't send Viper, we don't know either way as to if there's resources or not. And so countries like China, which currently again have a massive lead in the in the lunar capabilities and demonstrations as far as the 21st century is concerned, then they will be the ones to know. And if they know, also certainly, they will organically explore more based on what they find. And nobody can argue against that. So the only logical thing to do is to send Viper or something equivalent as soon as possible. And that is where India has an excellent opportunity, which we have now missed, because the LUPEX mission, which we spoke about earlier, the ISRO JAXA LUPEX mission was supposed to do exactly the kind of study that Viper was supposed to do. In fact, it had certain instruments that were planned which have complementary data to Viper as well. So, but with the approval of Chandrayaan 4, which again is great, but since we do a linear series of missions, our budget is very constrained. We can't do, with 1/10 or 1/20th of the budget of the Chinese National Space Agency and NASA respectively. we can't really think about doing these two missions in parallel. So we have prioritized Chandrayaan 4, but it also means that it has come at the cost of LoopX, at least for the near future. And so we don't have LoopX to offer that would have otherwise, positioned ourselves as a critical partner in the Artemis program as well. And at the same time, independently, it would have given us so much data about the moon south pole that would have been otherwise very difficult to would be still otherwise very difficult to prospect. So that's where I think we stand on that.
Uh, you- just I'm one curiosity I had you. Uh, so you made a lot of mention about China being in the lead on this lunar exploration, right? With its missions. Just a few words on what China has got right in terms of its lunar missions, because they're also a little linear with their series of missions, the Chang missions that they have conducted. So, just a few words or your thoughts on what China has done right to get, set this lead.
Yeah. So you are absolutely right that China's approach in lunar exploration has also been linear in terms of missions, but it has not been linear in terms of the associated infrastructure. So that's a very key distinction. So, for example, in the case of Chang'e 5, um, Chang'e 5 was the heaviest spacecraft that China sent to the moon when it launched. It weighed somewhere around 8,000 kilograms to the moon. And China previously, um, until 2015 or so, did not have a launch vehicle that was capable of launching such a massive spacecraft to the moon with such an ambitious goal of bringing samples from the moon. So what they did was they had already in parallel invested in the Long March 5 rocket to develop it, which is a medium heavy lift rocket. And that's what enabled China to send the Chang'e 5 and the Chang'e 6 missions to bring samples from the moon. And it's also what is enabling China to take on increasingly complex missions with Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8 as well. So that's one thing. So they invested in not just the launch vehicles, but they also invested in communications relay satellites. So, for example, with the Chang'e 4 and the Chang'e 6 missions, they had the Chichao 1 and the Chichao 2 relay satellites launched before launching these respective lander missions, which launched and then entered their respective lunar orbits, got operationalized, and then you send these lander missions on which they will rely. Because if you're sending a mission to the moon's far side, then you can't that phase of the moon that side of the moon cannot see Earth, and so you need a communications relay. And so it is through these relays that they were able to carry on their missions. So while yes, in terms of their core missions, it has been linear, but in terms of the capabilities needed to be developed to enable those core missions, it has not been linear. So that's an important distinction. That's one thing. The other thing that they have done right is that even if they were going linear in terms of their core missions, they had a very clear charted plan because China follows this 5 year process and they have a dedicated lunar exploration program called the CLEP, Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, CLEP. And so they have these 5 year plans that they follow and the next 5 year plans that they draft. And each of them is ensured to be feeding into the other, which is why you saw that there was a clear intention from China from the early 2010s that Chang'e 1 and the Chang'e 2 orbiters will feed into enabling the Chang'e 3 mission to land on the moon. And that would be that was the first for China. And then Chang'e 3 would enable China to conduct the Chang'e 4 mission to land on the far side of the moon, coupled with the relay that we spoke about, and then combine both of those things to enable an even more complex mission with Chang'e 5 and Chang'e 6. And now with Chang'e 6, with Chang'e 7 and with Chang'e 8, they are going to the moon south pole to do exactly the kind of resource prospecting about water ice and other volatile resource deposits that which we just spoke that Lupex and Viper are not going to do anytime soon. So the interesting thing with China's lunar program is that they have a very specific goal. They are set on eventually sending a crew to the moon, and they know all of the technological gaps that are remaining, as well as that they previously needed to accomplish and now have to be able to enable themselves to even attempt a crewed lunar landing. So they are ensuring that it's basically part of an orchestrated program and not an independent string of uh, lunar missions. So that's very critical. That's very critical in that's a very critical thing about their approach, and that's something that sets them apart from the Indian approach. And while you could argue, yes, that the US approach is also very expansive, but at the same time, the US approach is spread too thin. In the US approach scenario, it's not just investing in multiple capabilities like China, but they are also investing in multiple programs with multiple heads do not always talk well with each other, and some of them deprive the other of money. So, for example, while we are seeing a mission like Viper being cancelled, which is approximately a $500 million project, but at the same time, we see things like the SLS rocket getting funded to the tune of $2.5 billion a year by the US Congress with bipartisan support, with nothing to cancel that, or not cancel that, but rather to manage that, right? So what you're seeing is uh, a very incoherent mix of priorities on the US side, even though they are expansive. So if I were to put that in context with China, you have a, a much more focused approach there, and all of these expansive capabilities are converging to those focused set of missions, which is why I think they are very successful. And if you, the one remarkable thing that I can just, I'm just fascinated by is that they have basically not had a single failure. You know, so that's just remarkable.
I do understand that the Changi missions in the future kind of feed into their International Lunar Research Station, right? So I get how they're going to be collaborative on that front as well, right? So
Yeah, that is true. But again, we'll have to see how that evolves, because while they are signing deals with various countries to get on board the International Lunar Research Station project, we are yet to see any significant collaborative hardware contributions. What we do see, however, already is that there have been payloads flying on Chang'e landers, which have come from foreign space agencies, and increasingly so. For example, with the Chang'e 6 lander, there was a European payload. I believe there were two European payloads. My blog has the details on those. But the idea is that the Europeans did fly scientific instruments, one of a kind scientific instruments on the Chang'e 6 lander earlier this year, and they got fantastic results out of it. Similarly, there are other countries also flying instruments or have flown instruments on the Chinese landers, and China is increasing the capacity for that with every mission. So, for example, with Chang'e 8, they have approximately 200 kilograms worth of payload space available for international payload specifically, which is insane. Yes. So with Chang'e 8, what we are saying is that they have the Chang'e 8 is supposed to explore the moon's south pole in 2028, which will be the precursor mission to that will be Chang'e 7 in 2026. And both of these will explore again resources on the moon's south pole. And in these missions, compared to the prior Chang'e missions, there's ample capacity and increasing payload capacity for potential international partners to come in and fly payloads. So that interest is certainly there. But as far as the moon base is concerned, I think it's still far out, and we don't see any public announcement yet as to what kind of significant hardware contribution some other space agency is bringing along. So we'll have to just wait and find out for that.
yeah, check out that. Thank you very much. Just one final question: where do you see India's future in terms of its lunar explorations? We have Chandrayaan 4 that's announced, which will be a lunar sample return mission. Where do you see the future missions like Chandrayaan 5, Chandrayaan 6? What do you think India's priorities are going to be in terms of their future space missions? from
Right.
the
So, well, so I think the future is excellent, at least by itself. And the interesting thing is that ISRO has already announced and made publicly and has been publicly talking about a national roadmap that leads all the way into sending an Indian to the moon eventually by 2040. I mean, whether or not it happens by 2040 is a separate thing, but it's certainly a good aspiration to have. But before that, and what's more interesting to me is not the eventual goal of sending a sending an Indian to the moon, but the fact that even to enable that, we'll need to send an increasingly complex series of moon missions, similar to how China has been doing, for example. So we would need to do that as well. So Chandrayaan 4 is the first part of it, a very significant part of it, because the same kind of orbital gymnastics, let's say, that would be required for successfully accomplishing the Chandrayaan 4 sample return mission, wherein multiple modules will remotely dock with each other in lunar orbit and also some in Earth orbit, and the various phases of the mission. So that's a good starting point to plan a crewed mission on. But not just that, there are other missions as well. So one we already spoke about, which is LUPEX, which is probably going to be the mission after Chandrayaan 4 that India will undertake, which will be very crucial in informing us of a strategy for lunar resources, enhancing our understanding of the moon, and also enhancing our technological capabilities to explore the moon south pole, because that region is very different from the, let's say, the equatorial or near equatorial region of the moon, or even the region where Chandrayaan 3 landed. Chandrayaan 3 did not actually land on the moon south pole; it landed near the moon south pole. Um, and that region is still benign compared to the actual South Pole, where it's extremely rocky, it's full of slopes, there's so many hazards, the sun is very low on the horizon, the temperatures in the permanently shadowed regions where the water ice deposits are supposed to be are well below freezing temperatures. In fact, they are well in the realm of cryogenic temperatures. In fact, so it's a very harsh environment to operate in, much more harsher than the regular equatorial environment of the moon itself. So accomplishing a mission like LUPEX will also inform us and enable us to operate successively in that environment, which then you could build upon and do Chandrayaan 5, where India wants to demonstrate, or at least as of now, has the intention to demonstrate a lunar night survival, because the problem with most robotic moon missions is that once the lunar night comes along, which can last for up to 14 Earth days, then your lander will die, as did Chandrayaan 3. But if you want to sustain a long-term presence on the moon, then you have no choice but to build technologies that can help you survive the lunar night. These technologies could come in the form of, RTGs or RHUs, which the US has been using or China has been using. Um, um, in China's case, it is the RHU, for example. But the point is that these technologies could come in many forms, but nevertheless, we need to make that technology. The good thing is that with the RHU, which is a radioactive heater unit, it's a nuclear radioisotope which emits heat naturally, and we tap into that heat to power our hardware. So the good thing is with Chandrayaan 3, there was actually a little known small demonstration on the Chandrayaan 3 propulsion module, or also known as the orbital module, wherein ISRO, only after the Chandrayaan 3 mission was successfully accomplished, that they later on announced that the propulsion module had two 1 watt radioactive heating units on it. These 1 watt means that it's a very small amount of power. It's not really going to power any instrument, even for that matter, but it was a demonstration mission. And apparently, the demonstration has been successful. So that's excellent news, which means we now have indigenous RHE capability, which we can now put on future missions for lunar night survival or deep space planetary missions. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm excited more about these initial set of complex Chandrayaan missions, because they build the foundation for doing more, just as the previous three Chandrayaan missions have laid the foundation for these.
really important and positive piece of news I know we're getting to hear from this podcast. And Jatan, thank you very much for this insightful podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Tejas, for having me here. It was my pleasure. And to the listeners, please follow my blog as well. You can go to jatan.space, and you can also find it in the podcast description. And I hope you find it useful.
Thank you, Jatan. Thank you very much. This was by far one of the most informative and elaborative podcasts that I've been a part of. We hope that our listeners understood the relevance of India's Lunar missions, its approaches to explore the moon, and strategic and astropolitical underpinnings. We also understood the various approaches taken by different space missions, the US, the China, and I'm sure the policymakers here in India would be kind of keen to understand more. But thank you very much, Jatan. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and thank you very much for listening. See you next time.